Winter 1942. A Red Army soldier cracks open a dented metal tin somewhere east of Stalingrad. He expects watery soup, maybe frozen grain. Instead, he smells meat, real meat, pink, solid, unfamiliar. Stamped on the lid in English. In that frozen moment, one terrifying thought crosses his mind. How can the Americans possibly have this much food? If you enjoy deeply human war stories like this, consider subscribing. At this point in the war, the Soviet Union is bleeding, not metaphorically, literally. Entire cities have been erased, farms are burned, railways shattered, factories dragged east on flat cars while German artillery creeps closer. Soldiers are fighting on half rations, sometimes less. Protein is a luxury, calories are survival. Joseph Stalin knows this, even if he rarely says it out loud. Behind closed doors, the reality is brutal. The Red Army can replace men, it cannot easily replace energy. Tanks don't move without fuel, and soldiers don't advance without food. Ideology doesn't stop starvation. Across the Atlantic, Franklin D. Roosevelt faces a different war. America is not yet fully engaged on the ground in Europe, but the pressure is building. Britain is holding on by its fingernails. The Soviet Union is absorbing the full force of Hitler's war machine. If the USSR collapses, Germany wins the continent. Roosevelt makes a decision that will quietly alter the course of the war, not with bombs, but with boxes. The Lend-Lease program is born, and with it, an industrial flood the world has never seen. What arrives in the Soviet Union over the next 3 years defies belief. Locomotives, trucks, boots, radios, aluminum, copper, and food, mountains of food. But nothing shocks Soviet soldiers quite like the meat. Spam. To Americans, it's a cheap canned product, salty, odd, almost a joke. To starving Soviet troops, it's a miracle sealed in steel. Millions of tons of canned meat cross oceans and ice-choked routes. Murmansk, Archangel, Persia, the Pacific. German U-boats hunt these convoys relentlessly because Hitler understands exactly what this food represents. Every tin of meat is another mile the Red Army can march. The soldiers give it a nickname, Roosevelt's eggs. Half sarcasm, half gratitude. They don't know Roosevelt, they don't trust Americans, but they trust calories. And the effect is immediate. Rations stabilize, units that once collapsed from exhaustion begin to move again. Protein rebuilds muscle, morale changes subtly but unmistakably. This isn't about comfort, it's about endurance. A soldier who eats meat today can still fight tomorrow. Meanwhile, Soviet leadership downplays the aid publicly. Stalin will never admit dependence. Official propaganda credits only Soviet sacrifice, but internally, logistics officers know the truth. American spam isn't glamorous, but it's decisive. The trucks matter just as much. Studebakers become the backbone of Soviet logistics. Artillery moves faster. Supply lines stretch farther. The Red Army stops reacting and starts planning. And planning means attacking. By late 1943, the balance has shifted. Kursk breaks the German offensive power. Soviet factories roar back to life. But even as tanks roll west, the quiet backbone of the advance remains food. Canned meat in backpacks, in depots, in frontline kitchens. Moments like this changed history. Hit like, so this story reaches more people. German intelligence notices something unsettling. Soviet units are no longer stalling from exhaustion. They're advancing in winter, again and again. The Red Army is supposed to freeze, starve, collapse. Instead, it keeps coming. This is where disbelief sets in. Captured German soldiers report the same strange detail. Soviet troops eating meat regularly, not scavenged, not looted, issued, packaged, consistent. For an army that was supposed to be broken, this consistency is terrifying. By 1944, the Red Army is no longer just surviving. It's overwhelming. Operation Bagration annihilates entire German army groups. The advance west accelerates, and behind every spearhead is a logistical tale unlike anything the Soviet Union could have built alone at that speed. Spam becomes so common that soldiers grow tired of it. They complain, they trade it, they joke about it. That more than anything reveals the truth. Starvation is no longer the main enemy. As Soviet troops push into Eastern Europe, the tins keep coming. American factories never slow. While the USSR sacrifices blood, the United States sacrifices output. The alliance is uneasy, suspicious, transactional, but brutally effective. By the time Soviet troops reach Berlin, many of the men storming the Reichstag have lived for years on American calories. Not speeches, not ideology, protein. After the war, the story is buried. Cold War narratives harden. The West downplays Soviet sacrifice. The Soviets erase Western aid. Spam disappears from the official memory of victory. But history doesn't run on pride alone. Without Lend-Lease food, the Red Army slows. Without that speed, Germany regroups. Without momentum, the war drags on longer, bloodier, uncertain. A simple tin of meat helped carry soldiers from the Volga to the Spree. Share this story with someone who thinks WWII outcomes were inevitable. And yet, standing in the ruins of Berlin, few Soviet soldiers would ever publicly thank the country that fed them. Politics demands silence. Memory becomes selective. But somewhere in a discarded ration crate, rusting in the rubble, is the quiet proof that wars aren't won by ideology alone. They're won by logistics, endurance, and the unglamorous power of food. Long after the gunfire fades, the silence creates its own distortions. In the years following victory, Soviet veterans return home to a country that celebrates triumph, but rarely explains how it was achieved. Medals are handed out, parades march through Red Square, posters declare that the Soviet people defeated fascism alone through sheer will and sacrifice. Many of the men in those parades know the story is incomplete. They remember the taste of salt and fat in winter. They remember opening tins with frozen fingers. They remember that the march west did not happen on courage alone. It happened because, for the first time in years, they were not starving. But memory is political, and politics decides what is allowed to survive. As the Cold War hardens, any mention of Western aid becomes inconvenient. Official histories shrink the Lend-Lease program to a footnote, then quietly remove it altogether. In Soviet textbooks, American assistance is framed as late, limited, or irrelevant. The implication is clear: acknowledging help weakens the myth of total self-reliance. In the United States, the distortion runs in the opposite direction. The Eastern Front becomes abstract, numbers without texture. 27 million Soviet dead are acknowledged, but rarely understood. American audiences learn about Normandy, not the logistical marathon that fed the army that crushed most of Hitler's divisions. Spam, of all things, becomes the missing link between these two stories. Historians who revisit the records decades later are struck by the scale. Over 4 million tons of food shipped to the Soviet Union. Enough calories to sustain entire fronts. Enough protein to rebuild an army that had been shattered again and again. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. American planners understood something essential: ideology doesn't march, bodies do, and bodies require fuel. The psychological effect mattered as much as the physical one. Regular rations restore routine, routine restores discipline, discipline restores confidence, confidence wins battles. German commanders sensed this too late. They had gambled on collapse, on hunger breaking the Soviet will, as it had broken so many armies before. Instead, they encountered an enemy that refused to run out of energy. By the time Berlin falls, the war's outcome feels inevitable, but inevitability is always clearer in hindsight. Strip away the tins, the trucks, the calories, and the margin disappears. What remains is a slower war, a bloodier war, a war with room for mistakes, reversals, and negotiations that never happened. The irony is hard to ignore. A capitalist democracy feeds a communist army to defeat fascism. None of the systems trust each other. All of them need each other. History, indifferent to ideology, chooses efficiency. For the soldiers who lived it, the lesson is simpler. Survival is not heroic, it is logistical. Years later, some veterans will quietly tell their grandchildren about the strange American meat that kept them alive. Others will stay silent, knowing the story doesn't fit the version of history they're expected to repeat. The tins rust away, the labels fade, but the truth remains embedded in the outcome itself. The Red Army reached Berlin with rifles in their hands and American calories in their bodies. Not because anyone wanted it that way. Because war demanded it. Decades later, warehouses are opened, archives declassified, shipping manifests examined with cold, mathematical clarity, numbers replace slogans. They tell a story no parade ever did. American factories produced food faster than armies could consume it. While bombers were being built and ships launched, assembly lines were sealing cans by the millions. Spam, corned beef, powdered eggs, flour, sugar, not symbols of power, instruments of stamina. The Soviet war economy, heroic as it was, simply could not have matched that output while fighting for survival. Fields were battlefields, farmers were soldiers, horses were food, every calorie mattered. This does not diminish Soviet sacrifice, it sharpens it. Men still froze, still died, still fought block by block through cities turned into graveyards, but they did so with strength in their bodies that had not existed in 1941 or 1942, strength that came quietly from overseas. History often prefers clean narratives, good versus evil, one nation saves the day, one army breaks the enemy. Reality is messier. World War II was won by alliances that barely trusted each other, by systems that contradicted themselves, by choices made out of fear rather than friendship. It was won by factories, shipping lanes, spreadsheets, and cans of meat stacked higher than any monument. When Soviet troops stood in Berlin, the world saw flags and ruins. What it didn't see were the supply chains stretching back across oceans, through storms and submarines, to loading docks in America. The war was decided long before the final shots, in decisions about production, logistics, and endurance. And somewhere, lost in the rubble of history, is the truth that an impossible amount of food helped make the impossible possible. Not glamorous, not heroic, but absolutely decisive. And that is perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson of all. Wars are remembered for generals and speeches, for flags raised and enemies crushed. But wars are won by what keeps soldiers alive when hope runs out, by what arrives on time, by what does not fail. The Soviet victory over Nazi Germany was monumental, earned through unimaginable sacrifice. Nothing can reduce that, but sacrifice alone does not move armies thousands of miles. Starvation does not encircle capitals. Exhaustion does not storm fortified cities. Endurance does. The shock Soviet troops felt when they opened those tins wasn't just about meat. It was the realization that somewhere beyond the horizon, an entire industrial civilization was feeding their war, relentlessly, impersonally, at a scale the human mind struggles to grasp. That realization mattered. Because once an army understands it will not be allowed to starve, it begins to believe it can win. From Stalingrad's frozen cellars to the smoking ruins of Berlin, the Red Army carried rifles, courage, fear, and calories stamped in English. The cans were unremarkable, their impact was not. History doesn't turn only on battlefield brilliance or ideological purity. Sometimes it turns on logistics so vast they feel unreal. On decisions made far from the front, by people who will never hear the gunfire, but who decide whether soldiers eat tomorrow. That is why the impossible amount of spam matters. Not as a joke, not as trivia, but as proof that the outcome of World War II was not written in destiny. It was assembled, shipped, and delivered. One ration at a time. What makes this story linger is not just scale, it's silence. For most of the 20th century, two superpowers stared at each other across an ideological abyss. Both knowing a shared truth, neither wanted to speak aloud. One had provided the blood, the other had provided the fuel. Together, they had crushed Nazi Germany. Apart, neither outcome was guaranteed. In Soviet memoirs published after Stalin's death, small cracks begin to appear. Veterans mention American boots that lasted longer than Soviet ones, radios that worked in snowstorms, trucks that didn't break down after 50 kilometers, and always, quietly, the food. They describe the way rations changed the rhythm of war. In 1941, soldiers waited for orders, for supplies, for death. By 1944, they advanced. The difference wasn't bravery. Soviet soldiers had never lacked courage. The difference was continuity, the sense that tomorrow would come with enough strength to fight. This is something military theory rarely captures. Hunger erodes time itself. It turns hours into eternities. It narrows vision. It shrinks ambition. An army that is fed can think beyond the next meal. An army that isn't cannot. German commanders understood logistics better than most, until they didn't. Blitzkrieg depended on speed, shock, and short wars. It had never been designed for a continental struggle against an enemy that could absorb punishment indefinitely. Germany planned for conquest. It did not plan for endurance. When Operation Barbarossa failed to knock the Soviet Union out in 1941, the war entered a different phase, one that favored whoever could last longest. And in that contest, American industry tilted the scales. The Lend-Lease food shipments did more than sustain soldiers. They stabilized cities behind the lines. Workers in relocated factories received rations that allowed them to meet impossible production quotas. Tank plants in the Urals ran around the clock because laborers were no longer collapsing from exhaustion. This is where the idea of spam winning the war stops being absurd and starts being uncomfortable. Because it wasn't just the Red Army eating American food, it was the entire Soviet war machine. Every additional shell fired at Kursk, every rolling west, every artillery barrage that shattered German defenses, all of it depended on calories moving through bodies that could still function. The numbers are staggering. Enough canned meat to feed millions of soldiers daily, enough sugar and flour to prevent famine in cities already pushed to the brink, enough fats to restore strength lost in years of deprivation. And yet, none of it looked heroic. No dramatic footage, no battlefield glory, just crates unloaded in icy ports, men stacking tins in warehouses, quartermasters signing paperwork, sailors risking U-boats so someone they would never meet could eat. This invisibility made the aid politically easy to forget and morally easy to dismiss. But forgetting doesn't change outcomes. When the Red Army crossed into Poland, then Germany itself, Western observers were stunned by its momentum. The speed of the advance defied expectations. Analysts searched for explanations in tactics, numbers, ideology. They rarely looked at rations. By 1945, Soviet soldiers were fighting continuously for years, something no army can do without collapse unless its basic needs are met. Even elite units break under sustained deprivation. The Red Army did not. It adapted, learned, and accelerated. This is why the image of inevitability is so misleading. Victory feels inevitable only after it happens. In 1942, there was nothing inevitable about Soviet survival. Had famine returned on the scale of 1941, entire fronts might have stalled. German forces could have regrouped. Political fractures inside the USSR could have widened. Negotiated peace, unthinkable in hindsight, might have entered the realm of possibility. That door closed quietly, one shipment at a time. The irony is sharp. The most ideologically driven war in history was decided in part by the most unideological force imaginable: logistics. Production schedules, shipping capacity, calorie counts. Spam did not carry ideology, it carried energy. After the war, when the alliance collapsed, both sides had reasons to bury this truth. For the Soviets, Acknowledging dependence threatened the myth of self-sufficiency. For Americans, emphasizing aid to Stalin complicated the narrative of moral clarity. So the story faded. But history has a way of resurfacing what politics suppresses. Modern historians, freed from Cold War pressures, now see Lend-Lease not as a footnote, but as a pillar. Not the pillar the Soviet Union paid in blood at a scale unmatched, but a pillar without which the structure wobbles. This doesn't diminish heroism, it contextualizes it. Heroism doesn't require starvation. Courage doesn't demand collapse. Victory is not purer because it was harder. And perhaps that is the most human lesson here. We like to believe great outcomes come from great suffering alone, that endurance must be earned through pain, but history suggests something else, that support, when delivered at the right moment, can be just as decisive as sacrifice. The Red Army's march to Berlin was not just a story of brutality and willpower. It was also a story of supply chains spanning half the globe, of factories that never saw combat, of workers who never held rifles, and of canned meat that soldiers joked about even as it kept them alive. By the time the war ended, spam had become so common it was unremarkable, and that, perhaps, is the point. The most powerful forces in history often feel ordinary while they're happening. Only later do we realize how close everything came to breaking. Today, when we look back at World War II, it's tempting to frame it as destiny fulfilled, as a moral arc bending inevitably toward victory. But that arc bent because millions of small, practical decisions held it in place. Decisions about what to make, what to ship, who would eat, and who would not. In the end, the impossible amount of spam wasn't a curiosity. It was a lifeline, one of many, that transformed a desperate defense into an unstoppable advance. History did not move forward on speeches alone. It moved forward on full stomachs,